here today with my February wrap-up. February was not a fantastic reading month for me. In terms of volume, I read 8 books, which is the same as January, but I didn't enjoy them quite as much on average. I gave almost every book this month 3 stars, with the exception of one, which had 4 stars, but in retrospect, I'd probably downgrade that one as well. I'm not going to talk at length about any of these titles, partly because I don't really like watching long videos, so I don't really want to make long videos, but also because I've already spoken about some in other vids, and actually I'm planning to talk about quite a few titles in an upcoming video as well. So just kind of brief reviews and findings. The first book I read this month was The Rendezvous and Other Stories by Daphne du Maurier, which is a collection of short stories. I'm not a big short story reader. I used to be as a younger woman, but I don't know, in the last few years I just haven't really gone for them. But this is to try and get me back into the mood, and I would like to say it did that job admirably. Now, I do like du Maurier as a writer. I'm not as kind of mad crazy on her as some other people seem to be across booktube at the moment, but I think she is a good writer, and I've enjoyed the books of hers that I've read, and this was certainly no exception. There's about 15 stories here. They don't seem to share a theme as such, but my favourites kind of bookended the title. The first story in the book is called No Motive, and it's about a lady who shoots herself for seemingly no reason, and the detective that then follows the trail to unpick what's actually happened, which he does, and that was a nice, shortish, satisfying read, I thought. The last story in the book is it's like a time slip narrative. Bear with me, sorry, I've forgotten the title. I think it might be Slip in Time or something like that. Yeah, Split Second. Okay, nothing like Slipping Time, which is focuses on a middle-aged lady who leaves her house one lunchtime, has an accident, and when she returns home, her house looks very, very different to the one she left, and she seems to have slipped in time a little bit. Now, I enjoyed du Maurier's House on the Strand, which is a time travel narrative. I think it's something she does quite well, and that was a good story. But they were all good reads here. Definitely got me back in the mood for short stories, and was a solid sort of 3-star read for me. Next up is The Cement Garden by Ian McEwan. Now, this is Ian McEwan's first book, written when he was in his late 20s, and he actually wrote it in the summer of '76, which was the reason I sought it out, because I'm currently reading titles from around that era, and I'll be making a separate video on that. So this is a shortish book. It's around 200 pages, and it focuses on a 15-year-old boy and his 2 siblings over the course of the summer of '76. At the beginning of the year, their father dies, and then their mother passes away, but rather than telling the authorities, they decide to dispose of her body themselves in the cellar of their house. And it's about how they kind of, well, they don't really come to terms with things, but how things run over the course of that summer. There's some uncomfortable scenes in this book. There are themes of incest amongst others, but I did enjoy it. It was a very disturbing read. I think McEwan's very good at nailing those uncomfortable parts of human nature, and his prose is wonderful. Actually, it's so sparse. He doesn't waste any words, but he can really craft a good sentence. So I did enjoy this. I'm going to read Nutshell very soon, which is his most recent release, which is the retelling of, it's either Hamlet or Macbeth. I know this is terrible for an English teacher, but I do get them mixed up from the point of view of a baby in the womb. So that's coming up soon, but he's a fantastic writer, and I would recommend this, but I'm going to talk about it more in a different video. This got 3 stars from me. Next up is The Lonely by Andrew Michael Hurley. This won, is it the Costa? There's only a big Costa sticker on the front. Yeah, it won the Costa Prize a couple of years ago, and I remember seeing it mentioned a couple of times across booktube, but not heavily. And I don't know why, actually. I did quite enjoy this. So this is a debut novel by Andrew Michael Hurley, and it's from the point of view, again, of a teenage boy. I think it's about 14 or 15. Now, I can't recall his name, and I'm not sure if that's deliberate or not, because it's very much the story of this boy and his brother. We hear a lot about his brother, who's called Hanny. They come from a very religious family, and they holiday on the northeast of England, on the coast up there towards Cumbria. It reminds me a little bit of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, in that they are this very, very religious family who are kind of almost isolated because of that. Hanny, the brother, has a range of disabilities. He's selective mute, it's suggested, and it's probably today what we would put under the banner of autism is how I imagined it. But he lives in a residential school and comes home at holidays, and they go on this religious retreat to the Loney, where it's a pilgrimage basically, and they pray and they spend time hoping for Hanny's recovery from whatever it is that he's suffering from. It's never really made completely clear what his condition is. Now, this was the one that I gave 4 stars to because the sense of place is beautifully drawn. It's very evocative. It's one of those books that you can like lose yourself in, and I certainly did that. Now, there is a suggestion of the supernatural here, which is never confirmed, but actually, when I got to the end of the book, the events that unfold couldn't really happen without the supernatural, but you're never told what it is. And I think in retrospect, that's why I downgrade this book. I haven't thought about it since I finished it, which I thought I would. It didn't really stay with me. Whereas when you consider there are so many unanswered questions here, there's a lot of things set up that you don't really get a resolution for, and I've no doubt that's deliberate, but to me it's just frustrating when a book does that. So, you know, it's 4 stars, maybe 3.5. I just feel like I've got a bit of a downer on all the books I read this month, but it was very, very impressive from a debut novel. I'd be interested to see what this guy does next, and I'd certainly read it because he writes beautifully actually. That, like I say, the places were really, really well drawn and the characters were interesting. So there we go, it's a 4 from me. Next book I haven't got a physical copy of because I've already lent it to my mum. It's very much my mum's kind of book, perhaps more hers than mine. It's The Trouble with Ghosts and Sheep by Joanna Cannon. When I first started reading this book from the point of view of our 12-year-old narrator, I loved it. She is hilarious, really some laugh out loud funny lines, and that sort of that dramatic irony you get as a reader when you're reading a child's voice, and you kind of can see what's going on where perhaps she can't. Nailed it, so good. Reminded me a little bit of Elizabeth is Missing, the story I read last year, from the point of view of an older lady who had dementia. Has very similar sort of charm about the character, totally charming. However, the perspective does shift, and I don't feel that the other characters were drawn quite so well. It tells the story of events again in the summer of '76 as a resident of the street where the young girl lives goes missing, and all her and her friends sort of conspire to try and find out what happened. So yeah, it's a small kind of cosy neighbourhood type tale in the beginning, and then you find out some darker sides of the residents of this street. For me, it was just too long. It would have been a perfect 250-page book, but it was a 450-page book, and I did get a little bit bored towards the end. So we went from a promising 5-star read down to a 3, but I still lent it to my mum, so I didn't hate it, and I'm pretty sure she'll enjoy it. Next book was The Handsworth Riots by Sharon Dougal. I don't need to talk about this at all. I did do a separate review video on this, and I'll link that underneath. This was from the Moth Box this month, and I did enjoy it. Some really interesting characters, some interesting themes covered, a really promising debut, and I'd like to see what Sharon Dougal brings out next. I gave it 3 stars. Then I read Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I had incredibly high hopes for this, perhaps too high really, because I'd read half of A Yellow Sun last month and absolutely loved it. This is a different kind of story. We've got Ifemelu and her on-off boyfriend Obinze, who Ifemelu moves to America from her native Nigeria as a teenager, and it's about how she adjusts to life in America, and she has some quite difficult times, and how she's separated from Obinze and never manages to reach America, but we see his story unfold in Great Britain, and it culminates back in Nigeria with both characters. I didn't enjoy this as much as half of A Yellow Sun, but it had a lot going for it. The character of Ifemelu for me is much more rounded than the characters in her earlier works, who were perhaps a little bit too virtuous. Ifemelu is a good person, but she's also sometimes a bit of a bitch, and I really liked her. I admired her. She was intelligent, she was fierce, she was kind, and yeah, she was very, very well drawn, I thought, and it was interesting to see her story unfold. But for me, this is very much reflective, I think, of Adichie's thoughts on the black experience in America. interesting, but the middle parts of it, she uses the characters of her American academics, and it becomes a little bit of a polemic for me and less of a novel, and I found that midsection not as enjoyable. That's just because I want to see individual human stories here, and when she started to sacrifice that for the wider argument, it lost me a little bit. It was the Femelu and Abinse I was interested in, and when it returned to them at the end, it did pick up for me. So I would give this 3 stars, which is harsh, I think, but it's just I went in with such high hopes. I think if I hadn't have read Half a Yellow Sun first, I would have been received this a little bit more warmly, but I'm sticking with 3 stars because that's clearly just the mood I'm in this month. Now, this little book, The Forgetting Time by Sharon Guskin, I read this in one night and it was fine. You know, I was interested because it follows the theme of reincarnation in children. Now, as a child, according to my mother, I used to say some strange things about the person I was before I was me. And throughout childhood, I've heard other people say similar things or have similar anecdotes, and it's something I've always been interested in. We've got a little boy here who's 4 years old, who's quite a difficult child, and talks about wanting to go home, even though he's already home, and talks about having another mother. And with some digging and research with help of a professional, it uncovers that he does remember another life of a little boy who went missing some years ago. So it becomes like a detective story as they unpick what happened to the other little boy, and it's a nice, neat resolution at the end. This is much more popular fiction than literary fiction. It's not something I'd normally go for. Characters are a bit flimsy, but it's really pacey, a real page turner, and I enjoyed it. This is certainly one I would lend out to certain friends who I know enjoy this kind of book. It's a great example of the genre. So 3 stars from me. Finally, at the end of the month, I read Dark Matter, a Ghost Story by Michelle Paver. Again, I've spoke about this in another video, which was the try a chapter tag when I was deciding what to go for, and I'll link that one down below. But I'm pleased I went for this. It was a solid read. It took me 1 night, I think 2 nights. It was very, very dark, really atmospheric, had me holding my breath at times. More than, there's a hint of the supernatural here, but again, it's never really confirmed. But more than out and out scares, it gave a great sense of claustrophobia, of kind of feeling lonely, and when you're on your own, being your own worst enemy sometimes, I think. It was scary in parts, but it didn't do that ramping up to a fear and then back down that I like from horror novels. It was kind of like a spooky 7 all the way through. But yeah, I did enjoy it. I would recommend it. It's a few years old now, but if you can get hold of it, if you like a kind of spooky story set somewhere cold, very good cold weather reading this. I'm pleased I read it because spring is almost definitely here now, and I wouldn't want to pick it up until the cold weather came back again. But yeah, 3 out of 5 stars. Good read. So that's it, nothing overwhelming. I will say we're a few days into March and I've already read 2 books better than all of those, so things are definitely on the up from me. But if you've got any comments or queries about any of these books, as always, I'd love to hear from you down below, and I am going to do my Summer of 76 video wrap up next week as something a little bit different to keep me going in March, so I'll talk about some of those a little bit more. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.